أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن سيدنا محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي أبدا السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. All praises be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we gather this morning, inshallah, we pray that it becomes a blessed majlis of knowledge. And before I proceed, I must apologize for the voice because I'm recovering from flu, so it's not one of the nicest voices that you would want to hear on Saturday morning. And I'm not sure if I can last the whole hour that has been allotted to me, so inshallah I'll do what I can, and I have my brother and colleague, Dr. Muhammad, to carry on some of the topics that we will talk about, inshallah. So first and foremost, a very good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm here not just to speak on the topic that has been designated for our discussion, but also one of my responsibilities is to oversee the successful implementation of the Adil program. If I could start by asking a show of hands, how many of you have attended any of the Adil programs or the Adil Knowledge Retreat before? Or is this your first time? It's the first time for all of you. So welcome to the program. The Knowledge Retreat is something which is quite new. The idea of which is to discuss something which is contemporary. Of course, it's done in the English language, like many Adil modules. But it also gives an opportunity for us to raise questions, discuss the points, and also to learn from each other. So it is a new format. We hope that it does allow for a lot of interaction, for us to clarify our points. And as you know, that the issues that we confront today as Muslims are not simple issues. Many of them are extremely complicated. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that it's a cliche now that there's too much change that's happening around us. So it's often the case that when there's too much change, then you become a bit confused. How do you make sense of all of the things that we are listening to, we are hearing about, and that we are witnessing? And I thought it's important for us to pause for a moment to reflect. One of the sources of confusion that happens around us a lot is the things that we hear about Islam. And the things that we hear people speak about Islam, and here I'm referring to sources of Islamic knowledge or Islamic learning. And of course, we all know that, I think probably all of us, with an exception of one or two, probably everybody has a smartphone, right? So the access to information is at our fingertips. In fact, I think I recall that once I had to see a GP because of a medical condition, and I recall that the GP actually Googled the medical condition. So someone who is trained in medicine, right, done a complete degree in medicine, qualified to practice, and of course even to give medical advice and prescriptions, he or herself actually resort to Google to get some kind of information. Of course, the difference is because you are trained, you are able to tell whether this particular information or advice is the right one, or at least has got a good basis in the medical field, or to some novice, some amateur, someone wannabe doctor putting out that kind of information, or in fact even non-verifiable type of medical treatment that puts up that information. You can tell almost immediately. So I think it's important for us to locate the source of the problem, which is really about the enormous amount of source of information that we have access to, our families have access to, and our children have access to. And then what we have to do now is to look back at the learning tradition in Islam itself. Does Islam have a learning tradition? Does our religion have a learning tradition? The obvious answer is yes, right? We have a long scholastic tradition, building knowledge, spreading knowledge, teaching knowledge to its people. And we have to pause and compare our tradition with what's happening today, and then at least for a while, then we can make that assessment and think that we ought to do certain things in order to rectify the situation. We know, for example, that I think this is a very common thing that we all know about. The very first revelation in Islam that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in Surah Al-Alaq, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Iqra, Bismi Rabbika alladhi khalaq. Read in the name of your Lord who created. Read, Iqra. So the very first thing is about reading, because reading, of course this is about the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the wahy, but read, and reading opens the door. So we are inspired in learning in Islam, in Islamic tradition, we are inspired by the command to read. But it does not stop there. Because the next thing that the Quran keeps talking about all the time is for us to think, to reflect. Those who know Arabic language, I have in your midst, and I'm very happy to see my old friend, in fact my housemate as well in Egypt, Ustaz Hamza, is training the Arabic language, that the Quran uses a lot of the active verbs. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَدَبَّرُونَ. Active verbs, those who really think, who engage their intellect, who engage their minds, who use them, the mental faculty that God has given them. These are active verbs in a sense that it says you have to continue thinking and reflecting. So we are inspired by the command to read. That's the very first step. We are nourished, our mental capacity or intellect is nourished by the call to think. Tafakkur and tadabbur. And of course we have to be guided by a teacher. Our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about him, he says, "Allamahu shadidul quwa." The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was taught by the most powerful, one was extreme power. There are a couple of tafsir. Some says it's the angel Jibril alayhi salam, some says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Taught by the Prophet, taught by the angel, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we all know that there is a very, very brilliant example in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in hadith, narrated by Imam Muslim, hadith, it is famously known as hadith Jibril alayhi salam, right? And this was reported by Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. One day, a man came, was wearing extremely bright white. He looked like he didn't come from far, he didn't travel. Came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and then sat right in front of the Prophet. Their knees were touching each other. And the man placed his palms on the lap of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and then asked him, "Mal Islam? What is Islam?" And the Prophet said, "All the 5 arkan." "Mal Iman? What is Iman?" And the Prophet told him all the 6 arkan of Iman. "Mal Ihsan?" The Prophet explained to him. And then he said, "When is the day of judgment?" The Prophet ﷺ said, the questioner, the one who's questioned knows no better than the one who's questioning. So he said, "What are the signs of the day of judgment?" The Prophet gave some signs. And then the man left. Then the Prophet ﷺ asked Sayyidina Umar, do you know who that man is? We do not know. Do you know better, Ya Rasulullah? And the Prophet ﷺ says, هذا جبريل أتاكم ليعلمكم دينكم. This is Jibreel alayhi salam came here to teach you your religion. Now that was witnessed by the companions, the teacher. And of course all the companions had a teacher, the greatest teacher of all, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. That is a tradition in Islam. Then of course we have 14 centuries, right? 14 centuries of learning. And I'm also reminded by a saying of Imam al-Shafi'i radiallahu anhu. Some say it's Imam al-Juwayni, his student who said this, but anyway it's a very, very useful saying, which of course, if you look at the life of Imam al-Shafi'i, you can see that everything is there in his life. He actually practiced and exemplified what he said. He says, أخي لن تنال العلم إلا بسكة وإن جئت أن تفصليه ببيان ذكاء وحرص واجتهاد وبلغة وصحبة أستاذ وطول زمان. He says, my brother, you will never learn, you will never gain knowledge. لن تنال العلم. You will never learn unless you've got 6 things. Have you heard of this? Right? 6 things you need to have in order for you to be able to gain knowledge. He didn't mention Google. Did you hear Google? Or WhatsApp or Facebook? He didn't mention it. I'm sorry. He said, Dhaka'un. Dhaka is kind of intelligence, the ability to process information. When you want to learn, of course, you need to be able to understand what is being said to you, process it, and then of course you make sense of it, and then of course you practice it, right? Dhaka. Hirs. Hirs, some say it's eagerness, right? Can mean dedication, your commitment. Yeah? In the Quran, Allah SWT talks about the Prophet لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ حَرِيصٌ عَلَيْكُمْ. One of the Prophet's attributes was he was extremely eager about you, was extremely concerned about your well-being. Haris, helps. So if you're a little bit of, sorry Mr. Hamza, just going to your terrain, a bit of Arabic language learning here, if you, like a parent, or if you've got your best friend, your best buddy, and you're really concerned about the well-being, have you eaten, have you rested, are you okay, are you well, you know, like my voice is like this, are you really alright, have you taken your medicine, then you can say he is, you know, fulan harisun ala akhihi. Really care about, care about the person. So you need to be very eager about learning. What does that mean? It means if your class starts at 9 o'clock, you'll be there at 8:55. Right? Yeah. And that's why I respect the scholars in the past who were actually punished, and in Al-Ansar University, I remember, they locked the door. You don't care if you live very far away, but the class lecture starts at 9, they lock the door. And the students will bang on the door. Bang on the door. Please open it for us, because you've traveled so far to learn. Sorry. Haris, helps, right? ذكاء وحرص وصبر. You must be patient. Yesterday's khutbah was about sabr. You have lost it, brothers and sisters. You've lost it. Sabr. Sabr means you have to persevere. You don't gain knowledge overnight. You gain information, yes. I mean, you watch TV news and you Google something, yes, you gain information, that's right. But whether you have learned, you're not so sure yet, because you have to be patient about it. I always tell people that if it's real knowledge, you must have gone through hell to get it. You must have gone through a lot of hardship. You must have reached a point where you wanted to give up. Then, if you had persevered, then you have actually learned. If there was no pain, what's the saying? No pain, no gain, right? There is no pain, there is no gain. وَبُلْغَةٌ, of course you need to have means to sustain your learning, i.e. you have to have some means of paying the teacher for the course, right? If you don't have, in the past, at the time of Imam Shafi radiallahu anhu, what it meant simply was, you must have the means to travel. You had to look for a teacher. Now, if you didn't have anything to spend, to get transport, to pay for your transport, to pay for your sustenance, to pay for your, what's that called, all the expenditure for, when you travel, then of course you're not able to do that. وَالصُّحْبَةُ أُسْتَاذ, you have to be in the company of a teacher. You need to have a teacher. Now this is, of course, in today's context, one can argue to say, well, is this still relevant? This is something that we ought to discuss. But the idea of a teacher, of course, it also depends on what kind of teacher you have. Right? But the idea of a teacher is to be able to guide you. To be able to guide you. The best teachers are teachers who will not tell you the answers, but they will be able to guide you and say, this may not necessarily be the right way to think, you need to look at something else. And sometimes when you go too far away, then they will probably pull you back. Somebody there to really guide you. وَطُولُ زَمَانٍ, and Imam Shafi says it after all, he says, a lengthy period of time. طُولُ زَمَانٍ. If you want to get the knowledge, you have to live for a while. You have to spend time. And we know that the idea or the notion of knowledge itself in Islam is extremely vast. In a sense, Islam has a very expansive look on what knowledge is, al-ilm. And that is why if you recall in Surah Al-Baqarah, the conversation that the angels had with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Allah told them that He will be creating human beings, the angels disagreed. And eventually Allah did. And Allah says, you don't know what I know. And the angels then said, قَالُوا سُبْحَانَكَ لَا عِلْمَ لَنَا إِلَّا مَا عَلَّمْتَنَا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَلِيمُ الْحَكِيمُ. Excuse me. They said, praises be to you, Allah. Glory be to you, God. Subhanak. La ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana. We don't know, we don't have knowledge except that you have taught us. Then they say, Innaka antal alimul hakim. Indeed, you are all-knowing and all-wise. Now look at this word. And I always tell people that, when the Quran says anything, every single word, there is a reason for it. So whether we have discovered it or not. Now when the angel saying, Innaka antal alimul hakim, indeed you are all-knowing, all-knowledgeable, and all-wise. There is a difference between knowing and being wise about something. Today a lot of people may know a lot of things, right? But wisdom is something that cannot be taught. Wisdom needs to be acquired. And one of the ways that wisdom is acquired is through experience, is through the perseverance in the path of knowledge. You may know something and you may learn about something, but wisdom may tell you that this may not necessarily be the right thing. So having said all this, I leave you to reflect and consider. I know this was going to happen, so yeah, probably it's a sign for me to shorten the thing. But I've not even begun the conversations really. But I leave you to consider, right? This process of learning in Islam, and actually I really am grateful, alhamdulillah, and I'm thankful that you all come here for this kind of learning opportunities and for us to have this conversation. I think this is the right thing. Before I even continue, I want to also express my thanks, my gratitude to my colleagues from Muis, Office of the Mufti, as well as Masjid Al-Ansar, our host, to make this event possible this morning. So thank you very much. They've been working very hard. I can promise you this, to make this kind of event happen, inshallah. So, having said everything that I began this presentation about in terms of the idea of learning in Islam, that we have a long tradition of learning in Islam, we ought to consider how this then factor into a whole new landscape of access to information, in particular through the internet. Right? Let me state it very clearly that I'm not someone who is who runs away from technology. Those who know me knows that I am a big fan of technology. I Google a lot. I Wikipedia a lot as well. But what I normally do is I always look up the references that they have. Right? Even Wikipedia, they're not allowed to say things unless they have references. When you look at the references, then you know whether it's a reliable source or not. Unfortunately, when we're not trained, then often what we do is we take what we see and we think that that is the right thing. And even if we don't think it's the right thing, then we begin to think, well, somebody is saying this. Is this right? And that is what I meant by a state of confusion. What it also means is that the challenge for our religious scholars and religious teachers is a lot bigger today. Right? It's one thing to say, well, everything from the internet can be problematic, everything from anywhere else can be wrong and misguided, and not doing anything about it. And it's another thing for us to actually understand, recognize the landscape that has changed and do something about it. So we ought to do a lot more, and this is something that we are trying to work very hard to address, inshallah. So I'm very sure that many of you who are exposed to all these sources, right, have begun to realize that suddenly there are a lot of voices, a lot of representations, a lot of different things about Islam, the things you were not aware of in the past. And it's not about the internet, it's of course also about globalization, the movement of people, movement of ideas, so on and so forth. Now, having said all this, we ought to recognize that, now Muslims is a very big group, right? We all belong to a very broad tradition called Islam. And I'm going to state facts here, right? Islam has a very long and complex history. At least 14 centuries, but in many parts of the world, in many different cultures and societies, it has a long and complex history. Nobody will do justice to the history of Islam and what Islam is if you could summarize it in terms of how people believe and practice it in one or two sentences. Yes, it's true that we have a common monotheistic belief. Our aqidah is based on tawheed, right? That we only worship, this is the main article of faith, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Right? It's a common monotheistic belief. Anyone who deviates from this, of course, then deviates from Islam. We know it has a common origin. The teachings of Islam as we have it today are the teachings of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, embodied both in the Quran and embodied in a tradition were reliable as the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we have the two canonical sources, it's called Quran and the Sunnah. And we also have a long scholastic tradition that interpret what Islam is. This is where it gets a bit complex, right? So different scholars trained differently, living in different environments, they begin to interpret this text. Because they had to expand the body of teachings. This is known as collectively as ijtihad. which is permissible in Islam so long as you meet the criteria and you work within the parameters of ijtihad. And the other thing about Islam itself, and in fact not just Islam but also religion in general, and this is something we have to recognize, this is again a fact like I've mentioned it, that religion can have different significance for different people. In its entire essence, religion becomes a very personal thing. It's your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with God. For Muslims, it's your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So different people, because of your different experiences, you may relate to the religion in a different way. Some people, for example, right, and this is a very interesting debate that we may have. They are very focused on and have a lot of interest in rituals, ibadah. Okay? So for them, religion, Islam, is a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through rituals. So a lot of ibadah. They will do all the, of course the ones that are obligatory, the wajib they will perform, but they do a lot of sunnah, fasting, the salat, the qiyam, and the Quran. Very interested in ibadah. And of course then they begin to do not just individual ibadah, but also collective ibadah. So some of them like the majalis al-dhikr, right? Like the dhikr to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They do the salawat. They read the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It becomes a practice. Now for some people, because that is how they identify Islam with a religion with, oftentimes, if you have a different opinion on the matter and you say that this is not right, why? Because the basis of it doesn't exist. It is not in the Quran or in the Sunnah. In other words, it's a bid'ah, it's an innovation. I'm not entering into the whole theological debate about it, but I'm saying that insofar as telling them that this is not right, you will see that they will not change. They will continue to do what they do because through the acts that they perform, that gives them the meaning and significance as a Muslim. Okay? Some people are very focused on theology. Theology in a sense, the idea of God. Right? So the Aqidah. And some become very experts on this matter. So they go into the great depths of Aqidah and theology, and that's all their conversations are about, their dialogues are about, and they go into the specifics, and they of course then begin to carve out what is authoritative, what is not, and then they will tell you that, when you believe in a certain way, you believe in a certain school, that is wrong, so on and so forth. Okay? But because your focus is on theology and the other person's focus is on rituals, ibadah, even if you tell them that, the way you understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the way you understand God is not right, they don't get it. Because that's not their concern. Because Allah, as far as they're concerned, I only worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I do it in various ways, by all my ibadah. But why is it that we are saying that if I understand God in a certain way, that becomes wrong? Okay? Some focus on the social aspects, i.e. on the values and ethics of Islam. They say that as Muslims in contemporary societies, we must show the social side of Islam. We must show that Islam is inclusive, we can work along, work hard with other people. So they do a lot of humanitarian work, they do a lot of social work. To them, that is the idea of ibadah, right? They may not necessarily get involved in all these majalis and all, but they do it in a different way. And some people are focused on the politics aspect. They're not happy with Muslims not questioning, are we living in a kind of environment that is acceptable, in a political system that is acceptable? Who are our leaders? What are the sources of our law? Where is the Sharia? Where is the Quran? Where is the hudud? They will ask. They're not happy with that, and they say therefore, they begin to prescribe a certain way and say this must be the only way that you can live Islam. Other than that, it's not Islamic. I'm just stating some of these strands that you see within Islam, right? I've not gone into a discussion about what is right, what is wrong, at least in our opinion. But I'm saying these are different types of people that we find. I think in this room, I'm very confident that we are divided along those lines. Divided in the sense we've got these different preferences, okay? But don't forget that like I said, although we belong to this tradition and religion called Islam, we've got some commonalities, but these are the different ways in which we express our religiosity. So even before we begin to discuss some of these complicated topics, we need to remind ourselves and resist the temptation to overgeneralize, oversimplify. What do I mean by this? Often we find that people say, Islam is only Islam, there is only one. All Muslims are the same. The fact of the matter is it's not. That is not the case. So in order for you to look at a problem and diagnose a problem and find a solution to the problem, you need to be able to first identify what the problem is. Some feel very confused. They have a very strong love, passion for the religion and commitment to the religion. They say, I want to solve this problem. And they firmly believe that let's just return to the sources, the Quran and Sunnah, and everything will be solved. Like I said, the history of Islam, the complexity of it, again, that will not necessarily solve the problem. They say just return to the Quran and Sunnah, everything will be fine with Muslims. It's precisely the way that we read the Quran and Sunnah that has caused a lot of the problems, because of the different interpretation. So, saying going back to what? Of course, if he says that there is there's a Mosque, which is the Quran, and there's a collection of hadith, and say, let's go back to this. Of course, we have to go back to that. But the moment you open it up, what does it say? This is where we begin to have different meanings. So it's not as simple as just going back to that. And some people even go to the extent of saying, we don't have to care about and worry about the context, the environment that we are in. We are Muslims, wherever we go, we can fit in and we can solve the problem. Yes, that's true. But we will certainly face certain specific issues and ideas that we must be able to engage with and explain. Okay? And this is where we will talk about some of the topics later on about the political aspects of Islam. I just wanted to, based on all these preliminary ideas, I know it's been for 20 minutes or so, just preliminary ideas, but I'll just go to some specific examples, and then inshallah we will continue with a very specific case to be presented by Ustaz Muhammad, inshallah. This idea of the Sharia itself, right? So some people say, okay, let's go back to the Sharia, because Sharia is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's law, the law of God, sacred law, divine law, and of course Sharia will solve all our problems. And some say that because we do not rule by the Sharia, that is why we have a lot of problems. The question is, what is the question? What is the Sharia? What is the Sharia? Yes, it's great and very motivating to sloganize it, to say the Sharia is God's law, and by God's law we will solve a lot of things. But the question is, what is the Sharia? Today we know that a lot of groups have appropriated the idea. Of course, the most prominent among whom, because they've not just latched on the idea, but they have actually implemented it in their own ways, is ISIS. Right? They represent this idea that we must rule by the Sharia, and the Sharia is this. When I mentioned earlier about learning, this is where we have to look back at our scholastic tradition. If you, for example, today you log on the internet and you do a Google search on the Sharia and what it means, right? How do you understand the Sharia? What is the process in which you're able to make sense of what the Sharia means? Some people will tell you what the Sharia is. right? And of course, if you do an image under Google, if you just look at the images, you'll find that over 90% of what they mean by the Sharia, or at least what people look for when they hear the word Sharia, is simply hudud, meaning the penal punishments in Islam for some penal crimes like theft, adultery, murder, so on and so forth. Is that the Sharia? We know, for example, that Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, this was in the 12th century, began talking about the maqasid al-Sharia, the purposes of the Sharia. That Allah's law presented through the Quran and through the teachings of Prophet ﷺ was to protect 5 key things in human life. To protect the faith, religion, protect life, protect the intellect, protect wealth, and protect family. It's about protection, hence. First and foremost is to protect it. And of course, because you need to protect it, certain criminal offenses which will damage these 5 things need to be addressed and handled with appropriately. And that is why you had some punishments for certain crimes. But before you even begin to punish people, you need to make sure that the society is protected in these 5 areas, right? So it is of course a terrible misjudgment on anybody's part to forget entirely or ignore entirely, in fact I think it's a deliberate ignorance, entirely all the prerequisites of a society that functions and functions well, a society that can live their life in a safe way. They have protection for themselves, they have protection to practice their religion, they have the protection for their wealth, protection to procreate, and protection to bring up and develop their families. Meaning this requires the economy to function, to have the literacy levels be very high, people know and aware that there is an education system in the country. All these need to be in place. It's not really, the hudud or the Sharia is not about, as Imam Al-Ghazali says in the protection or preservation of 5 things, is not about scaring people so that they don't commit crimes. It's first and foremost about protecting the very basic fundamental rights of people. That today you can attend the majlis in this masjid feeling safe and secure. Nobody will infringe on your right to attend. Nobody will disrupt your path to this masjid, whether it's on the roads or on the pavements. That nobody will stop you from leaving your homes, when you want to leave your homes. And if somebody does that, then of course the law will take care of it. These are the protection, the preservation of things, which are essentially what the Sharia teaches. And that is why Ibn Al-Qayyim, rahimahullah, in the 14th century then said that the Sharia is all about wisdom, is all about achieving people's welfare in this life and in the afterlife. It's all about justice, mercy, rahmah, wisdom, hikmah, and good. And even in very recent times, a lot of scholars now have begun to develop this whole idea of what the Sharia is. Professor Hashim Khamali, for example, in Malaysia, he says that in our context, the 5 basic rights that Imam Al-Ghazali, Imam Al-Shatibi, Imam Al-Qayyim, Ibn Taymiyyah, and a lot of other scholars have developed, if you extrapolate them to our current context, it says, you must protect the fundamental human rights and liberties, public welfare, education, scientific and medical research, and the environment. You need to have all these in place, at the very least. Then you can talk about punishments for crimes and so on and so forth. It is extremely, extremely unfortunate today that the idea of the Sharia is really about implementing these laws in order to prevent people from committing crimes, when none of the reasons why they're committing crimes were even looked at in the first place. We all know this very famous story of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, in the Am al-Majara, in the year of famine. He suspended the implementation of the hudud, because he said that if a man cannot find food for his family, How could you punish that man for taking food from somebody who's got excess food? This doesn't make sense, doesn't square. Right? So you have to look at the conditions, the social conditions of the society itself. And brothers and sisters, we sometimes take this for granted. Right? One of the very fundamental right of every human being is education. Alhamdulillah, we take it for granted because in Singapore we are, by and large, very well educated. But in many other societies, people are not educated. They don't even, illiteracy levels in Egypt, as far as I recall, a couple of years ago, 80%. Egypt, with all the scholars and with all the institutions, don't implement hudud. They know that they can't. When people are illiterate, they'll do all sorts of things. The first thing you need to overcome is illiteracy. And of course, this has to be done, by economic means, developmental things for the society. I truly believe that the wisdom of Islam itself is really about developing a society that functions very well, that there is no need for such punishments, which are extremely, and that is why all the punishments under hudud are extremely punitive, because that is the last resort. If you have a successful society, a well-functioning society, that everybody knows that you need to respect the boundaries of the other person. If somebody's house, you don't actually go in and start killing people inside the house, or stealing their property, or you cause the hiraba. One of the worst punishments under hudud is hiraba. Those who are highway robberies, they call it, i.e. they fear people. To this context, it's like the terrorists. They really frighten people off, and they basically do whatever they like. This is one of the severest punishments under hudud because it's an extreme form of crime. If you have a well-functioning society, yet you have people who want to go out and kill people, you can't keep those people in society. So that is the rationale for such kind of crimes. But in many places where hudud is being used, right, because they say this is the Sharia, you will see that many of these prerequisites are not being met. Some scholars have developed this discipline quite well. Sheikh Muhammad al-Yaqubi, for example, he has listed down, for example, a suspension of hudud in various circumstances. First, in non-Islamic lands, traveling for military expeditions, when the knowledge of the rulings of the ahkam becomes obscure and uncommon, people don't actually know. When preventing harm takes precedence over acquiring benefits, when there are presence of doubts or shubuhat, and when there is an absence of proper authority. There is a famous hadith of Rasulullah ﷺ, says, "Idra'ul hudud bi-shubuhat," that these hudud laws need to be avoided when you have doubtful circumstances. The former mufti of Egypt, Sheikh Dr. Ali Jum'ah, when he talks about hudud, he says that we now live, of course he's making reference to this environment and context, but I think it applies in many places. We live in an era of shubha, in an era of doubt. One of the requirements for hudud, for example, is you need to have reliable, trustworthy witnesses. And if you have read the Quran and you learn about witnessing in Islam, you know that the standards are extremely high. Right? Like all the Rijal al-Hadith, those who narrate the Hadith, they have extremely high criteria and standards that they must meet. Meaning people of high moral integrity. Today everywhere we read, there could be exceptions in all cases, but today everywhere we read, we find that we do not know whether we can trust. Whether when somebody says they have seen this, or they are caught for doing certain things, because of the moral darkness that we have in society. So these are the reasons or circumstances in which the implementation of hudud, for example, should be suspended, and these are been detailed out by the scholars. So, I wanted to mention the Sharia and Hudud as an example that, again, some people may wow us with the idea that yes, we have to uphold the Sharia. But the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the Sharia? What is meant by the Sharia? Like I've mentioned, this has been discussed by our ulama and our scholars. And in fact, I want to say this as well, that in the context of our contemporary Muslim life, we know that it's important for us to first understand the principles of the Sharia itself, the usul, and we need to understand then the higher objectives, the maqasid, like I've mentioned, the examples of Imam al-Ghazali, Ibn Qayyim, al-Jawziyah, as well as Imam al-Shatibi. And there is also, within the usul in Islam about developing the Sharia, is the importance of the local custom or the urf, what is broadly known as the context. So Imam Ibn Qayyim, some people accuse scholars today, and especially those affiliated with institutions, the government, they say, well, this is the government propaganda about changing of urf customs or context, because they want to support the stance of the government, so on and so forth. Now, is this principle, or has this principle ever been discussed in the Quran? Has this principle ever been discussed in the Islamic tradition? Imam Ibn Qayyim, for example, he lived in the 14th century. In his kitab, Ilam al-Muwaqqi'in, which is a very useful source of usul as well as maqasid, he has an entire chapter on the change and diversity of legal judgments of fatwa according to changing times, places, situations, intentions, and habits, as well as in his muwafaqat. So this has been discussed in the past. When scholars recognize that, as the Muslim population grows, and Muslims go to different parts of the world, they interact with different cultures, they come together in different societies. Now they will have to ask questions and find answers to situations which are very unique to themselves. And Muslims have to make a decision. Whether you say that nothing in Islamic teachings can change, i.e. they are ossified and fixed, or whether they can be changed according to the customs and contexts. So Imam Ibn Qayyim talks about this, and of course the position is yes, تغير الفتوى بتغير الزمان والأحوال, that the fatwa, the positions can change based on a different context, so long as there's a methodology from which you derive these change rulings. So these are subject to the principles of ijtihad, so on and so forth. Today now, on the contrary, you will find, and again, like I said, this whole idea about where it's coming from, the sources, where it's the internet, so on and so forth, you will find people rejecting this idea in two ways. One, they will say that you look back at the time of the Prophet, you look back at the time of this and that, you don't find this. So this cannot be right. What you are doing and what you're saying cannot be right because you never found it in the past. So that's one position that they say. And the second position that they say is, well, this position is wrong because it is not the same as somewhere else at this current moment. So they compare it with the past or they compare it with somewhere else. On that basis, they say it is not right. When we know as a matter of principle, this has been discussed by our scholars, that through the principles and methodology of ijtihad, you can find solutions to your own problems, and the fatwa can be suited, the positions can be suited. I recall that many years when we had the great scholars of Al-Ansar in Singapore, and they were asked questions about our local community, they refused to answer. They said that you have your own scholars. I've just been here for a couple of days, I can never understand your society. Those who live amongst you know your society well. They know your problems, they know your challenges. So you have to consult them. And of course, this is on the basis that they trust that the scholars can do their job. Right? I think that issues will be a lot more complex moving forward. even our scholars over here recognize that it's not that easy. Like I said, that's why I mentioned the story of the angels when they replied to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the vastness of knowledge, the expanse of knowledge, it's immense. I think it's extremely dangerous today for anyone to say that I know it all. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are saying that. I know it all. I know that this is definitely right, everything else is false. I don't know how you reach that stage. I just don't know how anyone can reach that stage of, unless it's a delusion where you think that you have known everything. We know the Malay saying, right? This is of course about attitude and behavior. Ikut resi apa? Adil. Makin berisi, makin tunduk. It's about humility. It's about the more you learn and discover, the more you listen to people, you realize that yes, people may have a point. Let's discuss. Right? I may be wrong, but let's discuss this. But to say in very absolute terms that this is the source of the problem, I have the solution and that's only one solution and I won't listen to anybody else and everybody else is wrong and I'm the only right one. We know that is the attitude that was shown by Iblis, and for that reason he was Ana khayru min. I'm better than him, I'm better than the Adam alayhi salam. خلقتني من نار وخلقته من طين. You created me from fire, you created me from clay. Fire is a lot more powerful than clay. Why should I bow down to him? So that was the reason. So in a sense, all I'm saying is, when problems become a lot more complex, I think we need to have discussions. We need to talk to amongst ourselves. We need to listen to other opinions and views with an open mind and look for solutions. The slides are just on standby, by the way, so it's if you don't see anything that I show, it's all right. I think Sir Norman has some slides.
Yes.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Okay, good. Right. And the other topic, very briefly, is on because this will also be mentioned later on, is the idea of the Khilafah, the Caliphate. Again, it's interesting in Singapore in particular. Many years ago, when we grew up and I was in the madrasa, we grew up and when we were in Al-Ansar University, we never hear the word Khilafah. We talked about the Caliphate being discussed. Unless you're part of some kind of a movement or subversive group, then of course they do talk about resurrecting the Caliphate. Today, of course, it's in the mainstream, popularized by ISIS. In fact, it's not an idea anymore. They have actually implemented their own Caliphate. And in many of the things that they say, they argue that Muslims are obligated to leave their countries and migrate to the land of Islam, which is their land, to support the Caliphate and do the bay'ah to their Caliph, who is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Now, I don't want to go to the details of refuting all this, but all I wanted to say is there can be probably three reactions to this. Right? The first reaction is you get excited. Oh, finally there is a Caliphate, and finally there is a Caliph. What a brilliant idea. In fact, what a realization of a dream of generations of Muslims. So maybe I should migrate myself. Okay? So you begin to get interested in the idea. Second is perhaps you're curious about it. Oh, I didn't know that Islam requires a caliphate. So what is this about? Is this an obligation? Is this a duty in Islam to have to establish a caliphate? And is that the only way for us to live as Muslims? And the third is, of course, you say, because probably you have read and you understand the sources, you say that even if it's a legitimate, even if the idea of caliphate is a doctrine, which is an obligation in Islam, the one that is established by ISIS is not a legitimate one, therefore you're not interested, or B, you say that caliphate itself is not an obligation in Islam. So there are three responses. Depends on how much you read and how much you are interested in. All I wanted to say is, again, going back to the tradition of learning in Islam, there has been a lot of discussion on this topic itself within Islamic tradition. The scholars have talked about it. And the way the scholars wrote about the subject have evolved again within the different systems that they lived in. Example is Imam Al-Ghazali rahimahullah. He did write about the Khilafah, right? He did write about his Khilafah in two works. Al-Iqtisad al-I'tiqad and Al-Mustadhiri. He wrote about the Caliphate in two words. But he lived in an environment where there were two simultaneous caliphates. The Ismaili Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo and Al-Mustadhir, Khalifa Al-Mustadhir in the 12th century. So his whole work was to refute the other caliphate, right? So he talked about, he refuted the Ismaili Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, and he said that the support of Muslims must be on the Mustadhir, because he wanted to refute Ismailism, which is a branch of Shiism in Islam. Now you see that again a work of a scholar on the Caliphate took place in that kind of environment. I just wanted to show you a diagram. This is where I'm going. This is my slide. Yes. So if you look here, of course many of you are familiar with the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, right? For about 30 years, from Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq to Sayyidina Ali bin Abi Talib. So this period, and after that you see this overlapping, you see some simultaneous caliphates taking place on this timeline. When the idea of the caliph or the khalifa, according to Islamic political doctrine in classical times, is about one leader for the entire ummah. But here you see that the ummah is split, different Muslim communities in different places. Right? And even to be a bit more controversial here, you know that even during the Asrul Khulafa al-Rashidin, during the time of the rightly guided caliphs in Muslim Medina, right? Their appointment was not a straightforward one. It was contested. And because of this contestation, you even have until now the most enduring schism in religious history, which is the Sunnis and the Shias. We have it until today. And it started from here, this period. So, one of the reasons why a lot of Muslims get excited and say this is a requirement is because they don't actually even understand history. If you look at the nature of the Khilafah, and of course the first question we need to ask ourselves is, where is the source, where is the basis of it? Right? Our primary source always is the Quran. And if you go to the Quran, does Allah mention the word Khalifa? Yes, He mentions it. But He mentions it in a theological way, in a spiritual way. إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً وَلَيَسْتَخْلِفَنَّكُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ كَمَا اسْتَخْلَفَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. Because Allah will replace. Istikhlaf, khalaf is to replace somebody. Khalifa is a vicegerent. Allah puts us on earth to take care of this earth, to develop the earth. That's the Khalifa. But in terms of political leadership, you don't find it. Right? Do we have Khilafah caliphs in Islam, in history? Yes, we have. All these are them. Each this period we had the 4 caliphs, and we had a few more, the Umayyah, the Abbasiyah, and then the Fatimiyah, and so on and so forth. Some are the overlapping. And then you also have the last one, the Ottoman, which again is a very complex history, which ended in 1923. Now today, ISIS say we want to resurrect this. And they established it because they managed to control some land. Right? Some, like I said, some Muslims get excited, say yes, we have to support this idea. But my caution, and first starting point is really to even understand the history of it. In essence, we see that after the Prophet ﷺ, the Khilafah is about leadership of a community. And leadership of a community involves politics, not just religion. If you know the history of even the first 4 caliphs, you know how much of it is political. There's between the different factions, the different groups, and the players in that history. It's an extremely complex history. So first is to understand and really appreciate this complexity. And second is, of course, to really look at the sources. What does it say about the Khilafah? And I want to end on this particular note. Some people will tell you that, well, all Muslims in the past have accepted this doctrine of Khilafah, so why do we differ? My question is that true? Right? Because there are many, like I said, there are many scholars who wrote about this, but they wrote about this in a different way. Many of them talked about appointing of an imam, Nasrul Imam. Any community needs a leader, right? Any community needs a leader. You don't have a leader, nothing will move in that society. But does that leadership translate into a caliph that has that sovereign and religious authority over its people? That is something that we have to be very careful about. Imam al-Bajuri, for example, in the 12th century, 12th century Islamic calendar, which is about 2-3 centuries ago. He says that فَلَيْسَ نَصْبُ الْإِمَامِ رُكْنًا يُعْتَقَدْ فِي قَوَاعِدِ الدِّينِ الْمُجْمَعَ عَلَيْهَا الْمَعْلُومَةِ بِالتَّوَاتُرِ حَيْثُ يُكَفَّرُ مُنْكِرُهَا. He says very clearly, the appointment of the imam, and they use these words interchangeably, an imam as well as a khalifa, is not a pillar of religion, which is consensual, meaning all the scholars, everybody agree that it's a pillar, and known to us with authority, such that somebody who refuses to believe in this imamah or the khalifa becomes a kafir. Kashahadatayn. It's not like the shahada or articles of faith. والزكاة وصوم رمضان والحج لأنها ليس معلوما من الدين بالضرورة فلا يكفر منكر. So this is not one of the things that are automatically normal in religion, meaning everybody knows about it. This is in Tuhfatul Murid ala Jawharat al-Tawheed. So this is the Kitab Tawheed. Imam al-Bajuri talks about it. And I've just given you just one sample among many other writings on this particular topic. Right? So we have to be very careful. Of course, people are drawn to this idea for many reasons, or different reasons in fact. If it's in your political nature to like it, or if you're a political scientist and you think, well, let's look at the global political system, is it working? Maybe not. Maybe democracy, is it working? You've got all sorts of responses. Then one other model is the caliphate. Is it going to work? If you discuss it in that sense, right, as a discussion, then that's all right. Because A, it's a historical fact. B, it has done at certain points, like we know that the Khilafah Abbasiyya in Baghdad, it led to the whole, so to speak, the golden age of Islam, right? But again, in history, again, at that point, what kind of caliphate did you have there? It's a big question. That was a time when they allowed, Jews and Christians to work together and drive the translation industry. They translate a lot of Greek books into Arabic so that people gain a lot of knowledge. It's not the kind of caliphate that we hear about today. So that's one. And the other thing is, if you want to do comparison, that's fine. But if you want to say that this is a religious duty, okay? I want to quote to you what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi said, in support of this idea. And I think you all know who Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is, right? The leader of ISIS. So he said that the whole Ummah of Islam, indeed the world today has been divided into two camps and two trenches, with no third camp present, the camp of Islam and faith, and the camp of kufr and hypocrisy. The camp of the Muslims and the Mujahideen everywhere, the camp of the Jews, the Crusaders, the Allies, and then the rest of the nations and religions of kufr, so on and so forth. So basically he says two camps, that's it, right? Nowhere else escapes this division of the land of Islam and the land of Kufr. And therefore he says the first priority is to perform the hijrah from wherever you are to the Islamic State, from Darul Kufr to Darul Islam. Now, of course, you can go on to talk about the caliphate and so on and so forth. But I wanted to, the reason I mentioned this is to say that why is this idea very dangerous? Because what it says is that you begin to question your position in the modern world, in wherever you are. You begin to question whether you have an obligation towards the land in the country that you live in the nation state that you live in. You begin to question your allegiance. Should I obey the laws of the state? These are not Islamic laws. I don't live in a caliphate. I don't live in a land of Islam. So all these questions begin to arise. Now again, there are a lot of scholars, and these are scholars today working on these topics because it's a contemporary issue. The idea of a nation state did not exist before the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. A lot of scholars wrote back then in the classical period that was before. Now you have nation states. Now you have contractual obligations. So what makes, what are our duties in this particular context, right? So here scholars have begun to talk about the social contract that we have with the society that we live in, and also with the state that we live in. Sheikh Abdullah Al-Judahi, which is a Syrian scholar, there was a question when some British Muslims wanted to go to Afghanistan to fight alongside the Taliban. So Sheikh Abdullah Al-Judahi, is a great scholar of Islam, contemporary scholar. He talked about those who live in the UK, as I'm giving you the UK example, are under contractual obligations to the state in which they live. Because this is a natural consequence of the citizenship that we all bear. By accepting to live here, we have taken up a social contract to live within the framework of our legal system whilst practicing and perfecting our Islamic faith. Okay, so essentially, at the end of the day, the question again is, to what extent can you live as a good Muslim wherever you are? If your religious rights are protected, if your individual rights are protected, and you can practice your religion, all the fundamentals of it, right? Therefore, you have a contract that you have entered in with the state. And you ought to remain, and you ought to do your best in that particular environment. Sheikh Abdullah bin Bahya has said similar things. In fact, even Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and a lot of the contemporary scholars. It's not something that we don't find in current scholarship, because they think it's very important, because some of these ideas that say that you cannot live in these countries and you should not contribute to the betterment of the society. So some of these ideas have been refuted by some of the scholars. So when we understand this, and therefore we understand that the dangers of such ideologies which begin to question, which begin to set doubts in ourselves, as well as not just about the state, but also about living with other people, right? Living with non-Muslims. And there are a lot of examples from the Seerah of Rasulullah ﷺ, as well as in the Quran, in Surah Al-Mumtahana, for example. I'll end with the verse from the Quran in Surah Al-Mumtahana. لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم إن الله يحب المقسطين. Allah does not forbid you to do good and be just, be fair to those who have not driven you, or who have not fought you for your religion or driven you from your homes. So wherever you are, and this is in the Quran, wherever you are, if your rights to live are protected and your rights to practice religion are protected, then you should contribute. In fact, tabarruhum, the word that Allah uses, bir has an extremely heavy meaning of doing a lot of good. But tuqsitu ilayhim, and to be fair to them, meaning that you need to respect the contractual agreement that you have entered, respect the laws, respect the rights of others, so on and so forth. So this is a big discussion. I have to end here. Inshallah, if there are questions, I think there will be. I'll take it up during the Q&A session. Before I finish, I apologize to Dr. Muhammad. I wanted to shorten this, but I ended up taking a lot more time. So inshallah, we'll speak again in the Q&A session. Shukran lakum. الله ولي التوفيق والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
السلام.